Okay, so Rome, right. I mean, everyone's heard of Rome, but going from like a tiny village to basically ruling the entire Mediterranean, that's got to be a wild story. We're going to try to figure that out, how they actually pull that off.
Yeah, it's a really long story.
Yeah, and a really, really long time ago.
Yeah, exactly. And we've got all these crazy stories, like Romulus and Remus, the whole she-wolf thing in 753 BC.
Yeah, everyone's heard about that.
Right. And then you have like Aeneas, coming from Troy after the war. Like that's tying Rome to this whole legendary past, which Virgil wrote about in the Aeneid.
Right, like connecting themselves to something even bigger than themselves.
Exactly. And that's not even all of it. There are all these other stories and legends. And even the name Rome itself is kind of a mystery, which all shows you how the Romans were thinking about themselves even way back then.
So, I mean, where do we even start trying to figure out what actually happened?
Well, we've got to look at the archaeology because it tells a completely different story than those myths.
Yeah, like what kind of stuff are we talking about?
So there's evidence of people living in Rome way earlier, like maybe the 10th or even the 9th century BC.
Wow, that's like way before Romulus and Remus.
Exactly. And they started out on the Palatine Hill, one of the 7 hills. It wasn't like, bam, Rome's here. It was a slow process of settling those 7 hills over hundreds of years.
And what about the Forum? Wasn't that a swamp or something?
Yeah, it was basically marshland, and they had to drain it. That happened around 650 BC.
So like public works projects from the very beginning.
Yeah, they had to work together to make the city livable. And by 600 BC, it looks like all those different settlements on the hills had joined together. The Greeks called this a synoikismos, a coming together of communities.
And all this was happening even before Rome as we know it.
Right. There's even a wall on the Palatine Hill that they've found dating from like 730, 720 BC, way before Romulus and Remus supposedly show up.
Okay, so we've got this gradual coming together of settlements. But why there? I mean, what was so special about this spot?
Well, Rome's location is a big part of its success. Think about the Tiber River. Fresh water, fertile soil, a way to get around, even a bit of protection from enemies.
I mean, it's a river, not exactly Fort Knox.
Well, no. But still, it's important. And then being so close to the Mediterranean was a huge advantage for trading. Plus, Ostia, their port city, gave them some protection from attacks coming from the sea.
Okay, so river, sea, check and check. What else?
Oh, and those 7 hills, natural fortifications, and the volcanic soil around there, super fertile, great for farming.
Makes sense. You got to feed the people.
Absolutely. And there's one more thing. That natural ford on the Tiber, where the river was shallow enough to cross, that made Rome a crucial spot for anyone traveling north to south, and vice versa. And that was connected to important routes like the Via Salaria, where they got salt, which was a big deal back then.
So basically, they were in the perfect spot, right in the middle of everything.
Yeah, the central Mediterranean, perfect for trade, and, as it turned out, for administering a vast empire.
So these early Romans, they weren't just figuring things out on their own, right? Who were their neighbors, and how did they influence things?
Oh, yeah, totally. So to the north, you had the Etruscans. They were really advanced. They had this urban, luxurious lifestyle. They were amazing metalworkers. They had cool architecture with arches and stone buildings. And they even practiced divination, trying to figure out the future.
Like reading animal entrails.
Yep, things like that. And then to the south, there were the Greeks, who brought literacy, different architectural styles, and more religious ideas. Rome was really good at taking these ideas and making them their own, which helped them to grow and develop.
Like a cultural melting pot.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, they even took the Phoenician alphabet from the Greeks and turned it into the Latin alphabet, which we still use today in a way.
That's a pretty big deal. So all this going on, we get to the time of the kings, right?
Yeah.
753 to 509 BC. I know you're going to say you can't take it literally.
Well, yeah. It's likely there weren't exactly 7 kings, and the stories are pretty well embellished.
Mythologized.
Exactly. But they do tell us something about how the Romans saw their early history. So you've got Romulus, the founder, establishing those first institutions. Then Numa, focusing on religion and adding to the calendar. Tullus, the warrior, conquering Alba Longa. Uncas, who built Ostia, their port.
So each king sort of represents a different aspect of Rome's development.
That's a good way to put it. And then you get to the Etruscan kings, guys like Tarquinius Priscus and Servius Tullius. They really developed the city, drained those marshes, improved the forum, built temples, built that big wall, the Servian wall, and of course the Cloaca Maxima, their sewer system, which was a pretty amazing feat of engineering. Oh, and they really boosted trade and officially introduced the alphabet.
And what about that last king, Tarquinius Superbus? Wasn't he a bit of a tyrant?
Yeah, that's the story. He's supposed to be the reason they got rid of the kings and established the Republic around 509 BC.
And that's where the famous story of the rape of Lucretia comes in, right?
Yeah.
Tarquin's son assaults his noblewoman, Brutus leads the revolt, kicks out the king, and boom, the Republic is born.
Right, and they set up 2 consuls to rule instead of a king.
But how much of that is actually true?
Well, modern historians are a little skeptical. I mean, the Lucretia story might be exaggerated, maybe even completely made up.
Yeah, does sound a bit dramatic.
Some scholars think it was more about an aristocratic coup, the nobles wanting more power, or maybe there was outside involvement, like Lars Porsena, this Etruscan king.
So maybe not as simple as the traditional story.
Exactly. It's possible the kingship just gradually faded away. It was happening in other places around the Mediterranean at the same time. And remember, Etruscan power was declining too.
Okay, so the kings are out. What happens next? Like, what did this new republic actually look like?
So you had the Senate, right? It started as just an advisory body to the kings, but in the Republic, it gained a lot more power, a lot more influence over, well, pretty much everything.
Like, what kind of power?
They controlled the finances, directed the military, oversaw all the civil administration, took care of public works, even had some judicial oversight, and they were the main ones dealing with other countries. They could issue something called senatus consulta, which were basically advice or opinions that held a lot of weight. And in times of crisis, they could appoint a dictator, someone with absolute power.
Whoa, absolute power. Sounds kind of risky.
Yeah, it definitely could be, which is why it was only supposed to be temporary.
Okay, makes sense. So besides the Senate, who else was calling the shots?
So there were these different assemblies. One was called the Comitia Curiata, but they were more symbolic, not really making big decisions. Then you had the Comitia Centuriata. They were organized based on wealth, so the richer you were, the more say you had, and they were in charge of electing higher officials like consuls and praetors and declaring war. And then there was the Comitia Tributa, which were organized by tribes, and they elected lower-level officials and dealt with legislation. And lastly, there was the Concilium Plebis, specifically for the plebeians, where they could elect their own officials, like tribunes and aediles.
Wait, back up a second. Plebeians. Who are they?
Right, good question. So Roman society was divided. You had the patricians, the wealthy nobles, who basically had all the power at the beginning. And then you had the plebeians, the commoners, who initially had very few rights.
So not exactly a fair system.
Yeah, there was definitely tension there, which led to this big struggle called the Conflict of the Orders. It lasted for centuries, starting around 500 BC and going all the way to 287 BC.
Centuries. Wow. So what did the plebeians do? Just sit around and take it?
Definitely not. They fought hard for their rights, and they eventually won some major victories. They got their own officials, the tribunes, who had the power to veto any laws or actions that they thought were unfair to the plebeians. They even got access to the consulship, the highest office in the land. And finally, they got the Romans to write down their laws, the law of the 12 tables, so that everyone knew what they were and how they applied to them.
Okay, so things were changing, at least for the plebeians.
Yeah.
But what about all these different officials you mentioned? What do they actually do?
All right, so you've got the consuls at the top. They were like co-presidents, each with the power of imperium, which basically meant they were the top dogs in charge of the military and the government. Then there were the praetors, who were in charge of the law and the courts. They also led armies in the provinces and had imperium as well. Then came the censors, who were responsible for conducting the census, keeping track of who was who and how much money they had. They also chose who got to be in the Senate and had a lot of power over public morals.
Public morals? Like what?
Yeah, they could punish people for behaving badly, like adultery or being too extravagant. It was kind of a big deal back then.
Interesting. So who else is there?
Right. Next were the aediles, who basically took care of day-to-day stuff in the city, like maintaining public buildings and organizing games and festivals.
I like party planners.
Kind of, yeah. And then you had the quaestors, who were in charge of the money. And, of course, there were the plebeian tribunes, who we already talked about. They had the power to veto anything they thought was bad for the plebeians, and they were considered sacrosanct, meaning you couldn't harm them without facing serious consequences.
Wow, that's some serious power. So was the conflict between the patricians and plebeians the only problem Rome had to deal with?
Oh, no, definitely not. Remember, Rome was expanding its territory all this time, and that meant war.
Yeah, you don't get to be an empire by sitting around being nice to your neighbors.
That's for sure. They had conflicts with their Latin neighbors, the Sabines, and, of course, the Etruscans.
Oh, right, the Etruscans. They were
Yeah.
pretty powerful, weren't they?
They were, but eventually Rome got the upper hand. They fought some major battles like the Battle of Lake Regillus against the Latins. Eventually, they defeated the Latins and integrated them into the Roman state, offering some citizenship and alliances.
So like a carrot and stick approach.
Exactly. They did something similar with the Sabines. There's that famous story of the Sabine women being abducted, which probably didn't happen quite like that, but there were definitely ongoing clashes between the two groups. Eventually, though, the Sabines were defeated and incorporated into Rome, and then there were the Etruscans. Those wars went on for centuries, from the time of the kings all the way to the 3rd century BC.
I bet those were some intense battles.
Oh, yeah. Imagine huge armies clashing with swords and spears. It was brutal. One key moment was the fall of Veii, a major Etruscan city, in 396 BC. That was a major victory for the Romans. And by 265-264 BC, they basically controlled all of Etruria.
So what drove this expansion? Was it just about power?
It was partly about security. The more land they controlled, the safer they felt. They also needed resources, like land for farming and salt, which was super important. But there was also ambition involved. Roman leaders wanted glory and wealth for themselves and for Rome.
So a mix of pragmatism and ego.
Pretty much. And of course, conquests brought economic benefits, loot, slaves, tribute from conquered peoples.
And of course, the more land they controlled, the more powerful they became, which led to more conquests. It's a bit of a cycle, isn't it?
Absolutely. And we can't forget about their military strength, which was a major factor in their success. They're very organized, very disciplined, and their strategic location and resilience, even when things went wrong, that helped a lot too. Plus, their policies of integrating conquered peoples meant they weren't constantly fighting rebellions, at least not on a huge scale.
Okay, so we've got this picture of early Rome expanding its power, fighting wars, dealing with internal conflicts. But what was life actually like for the average Roman in those days?
It was pretty different from today. They were polytheistic, believing in lots of gods, starting with more animistic beliefs like noumena, spirits associated with places and things, even household spirits. Over time, it evolved into a more structured pantheon, with the Capitoline triad, Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva becoming really important.
And then they started adopting Greek gods too, right?
Right, they saw similarities between their own gods and the Greek ones, and they started incorporating them into their beliefs, like Mars becoming associated with Ares, the god of war.
So religion was a big deal.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Rituals were super important, and there were all these priesthoods dedicated to different gods. The most important priest was the Pontifex Maximus, who oversaw all religious matters. And when they conquered new people, they often absorbed their gods as well, adding even more deities to their already crowded pantheon.
It sounds like they were pretty open to new ideas, at least when it came to religion.
Yeah, they were pragmatic that way. But it's also interesting how religion played a role in their politics and their identity as Romans.
Okay, so religion, check. What about language and literature?
Well, Latin was the main language, of course. It was constantly evolving, and it became super important for administration and law as the empire grew.
But the educated folks also spoke Greek, right?
Yeah, Greek was the language of philosophy, literature, and science, so anyone who wanted to be considered educated had to learn Greek.
Do they have a lot of written stuff from those early days?
Not really. Early written records are pretty scarce, so we have to rely on accounts written much later, like Livy and Dionysius of Halicarnassus, who were writing in the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD, respectively.
So they were basically piecing together stories that had been passed down for generations.
Pretty much. Oral tradition was really important, but they did eventually start producing their own literature in Latin, and you can see the Greek influence there too.
Makes sense. What about the law? Were they just making it up as they went along?
Well, not entirely. They had this concept of Caesius Civil Quiritium, which was the law specifically for Roman citizens. But they also developed the Caesius Gentium, which applied to foreigners because, as their empire grew, they had to deal with people from all over.
Sounds complicated. Did they ever write any of this stuff down?
Yeah, that's where the law of the 12 tables comes in. That was their first major attempt to codify their laws, to write them down so that everyone knew what they were.
So kind of like their constitution?
It wasn't exactly a constitution in the modern sense, but it was a huge step towards a more structured legal system. It's also important to remember that they had two kinds of law: Scius Scriptum, which was written law, and Aegis Non Scriptum, which was unwritten law based on custom and tradition.
So even with written laws, tradition still mattered.
Yeah, it was a big part of Roman culture. And then you have the praetors, who were the judges. They had the power to issue edicts, which were basically interpretations of the law that could adapt it to new situations.
So the law could change over time.
Absolutely, and that's where the jurisprudentes come in. They were legal experts who studied the law and wrote commentaries on it, kind of like law professors today.
I can just imagine those guys arguing about legal technicalities. Okay, so we've got religion, language, law. What about family and society?
Well, it was a patriarchal society. The oldest male in the family, the paterfamilias, had absolute authority over everyone else in the household, even adult sons. This was called patria potestas, the power of the father.
Sounds kind of intense.
It was a hierarchical society. They had a strong emphasis on family and tradition, on duty and honor, and they were really big on ancestor veneration, paying respect to their dead relatives.
So family history was a big deal. What about women? What were their roles?
Women's roles were pretty limited, at least at first. They were expected to be wives and mothers, and they didn't have a lot of legal independence. Marriages were usually arranged, and it wasn't uncommon for there to be a big age difference between husband and wife.
Not exactly a recipe for romance.
No, not really. But it's important to remember that this was a different time and a different culture.
Of course, things change over time, but back then they had their reasons, right?
Yeah, their whole society was structured around these ideas of family, duty, and tradition. These values, by the way, are super important to understand. Mos maiorum, the way of the ancestors, virtus, manliness and courage, fides, loyalty and trustworthiness, gravitas, seriousness and dignity, constantia, steadfastness and perseverance. These were like the core values that Romans were supposed to live by.
It's fascinating how these ancient values still resonate even today.
They really do. And another key aspect of Roman society was the patronage system called clientela. Basically, powerful people would offer protection and support to less powerful people, their clients, in exchange for loyalty and services.
So like a network of favors.
Yeah, exactly. It was how things got done in Roman society, and hierarchy was everywhere, even in the way people dressed. You could tell someone's social status by their clothes, and hospitality was huge. They took welcoming guests very seriously.
Okay, so family, social structure, all very important. But what about art and architecture?
They were definitely influenced by the Etruscans and Greeks, but they also developed their own style. They used a lot of local materials like brick and stone, and later they started using marble. They were great engineers, too. They invented Roman concrete, which was super strong and durable.
Ah, Roman concrete, the stuff that lasts for centuries.
Yeah, exactly. And they were masters of arches, vaults, and domes, which allowed them to build some incredible structures.
Like what kind of structures?
Oh, think of the temples, like the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, the biggest temple in Rome. And their public works were amazing. Roads, aqueducts, sewers, they built it all.
So their engineering skills helped them create a powerful and lasting empire.
Absolutely. And when it came to art, they favored realism, especially in their portraiture and historical reliefs. Their sculpture is incredible, and they also did beautiful mosaics and frescoes. Art was a way to express power and tell stories about their history and values.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from religion to law to art. Is there any way to sum up what made early Rome so successful? Like, what was the secret sauce?
Well, it wasn't one single thing. It was a whole bunch of factors working together. Their location was crucial, being on the Tiber River, having those 7 hills for defense, the fertile land for agriculture, and their strategic position in the central Mediterranean.
So geography played a big role.
Definitely. But their political system was important, too. It was a mixed constitution, with power shared between different branches of government. It wasn't always smooth sailing, but the inclusion of the plebeians and the development of their legal system were key factors in their stability and resilience.
And then there's their military strength, right?
Oh, absolutely. Their army was a well-oiled machine. They had great organization, tactics, and engineering skills, and they could draw on a large pool of manpower. And they were resilient. Even when they suffered defeats, they would bounce back.
And we can't forget their social structure and values. You mentioned those earlier.
Right. Those played a huge role, too. The emphasis on family, duty, and tradition, all those core values like mos maiorum, virtus, fides, gravitas, constantia, they shaped Roman society and gave them a strong sense of identity and purpose. And the patronage system was key to maintaining order and getting things done.
It sounds like they were a pretty formidable bunch.
They were. And their ability to adapt and innovate culturally and technologically, that was another big factor in their success. And of course, their economy, fueled by agriculture, trade, and conquest, gave them the resources they needed to grow and expand.
So it really was a perfect storm of factors that allowed Rome to go from a small village to a mighty empire. But things weren't always smooth sailing, were they?
No, not at all. As Rome grew, it faced new challenges, and by the 1st century BC, the Republic was in crisis.
Yeah, things were starting to fall apart.
Internal tensions were rising, civil wars were breaking out, and powerful individuals like Marius and Sulla were vying for control.
And then Julius Caesar enters the picture.
Exactly. Caesar's conquests in Gaul, his crossing the Rubicon, his appointment as dictator for life, his reforms, and his assassination in 44 BC, those were all pivotal moments that shook the Republic to its core.
And out of that chaos, the empire emerged.
Exactly. The Second Triumvirate, more power struggles, and then Octavian's victory over Antony at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. Those events paved the way for Octavian to become Augustus, the first emperor of Rome.
And that's where we get the Pax Romana, right? The Roman peace.
Exactly. Augustus was a shrewd politician and a brilliant administrator. He reformed the military, took on the role of Pontifex Maximus, established a civil service, reformed the tax system, created police and fire services for Rome, launched massive building projects, reformed the currency, and reorganized the provinces. He expanded the empire and secured its borders, ushering in a period of unprecedented peace and prosperity.
And that's also when we see the flowering of Roman culture and literature, right?
Absolutely. The Augustan age was a golden age for Roman art, literature, and architecture. They were building everywhere, turning Rome into a city of marble.
It's amazing how Augustus managed to pull all this off.
It really is. He was a master at consolidating power while maintaining the facade of the Republic. That's what the Principate was all about. It looked like a republic, but Augustus, as princeps, the first citizen, held all the real power. He controlled the military, the finances, the administration. He created institutions that would last for centuries. And the Pax Romana brought peace and stability to the Mediterranean world, allowing Roman culture and influence to spread far and wide.
So we've come a long way in this deep dive, from those legendary origins and early settlements, through the kingdom and the republic, all the way to the birth of the empire with Augustus. It's incredible how much happened in those early centuries.
It really is. It was a time of incredible change and upheaval, but it also laid the foundation for one of the most influential civilizations in human history.
And that brings us to our final question for you, dear listener. Considering this whole story, the myths, the archaeology, the political struggles, the military conquest, the cultural exchanges, what do you think was the most crucial ingredient in Rome's early success and its transformation into a global superpower? What was the key element that made it all possible? Think about it and maybe do some more digging on your own. It's a question worth pondering.